During my mother's funeral, things took an unexpected turn. The day had already been difficult, my heart was heavy, filled with sorrow, and I was trying to navigate through the pain of losing her. But then, when my mother-in-law Ava arrived, things took an uncomfortable shift. She walked in with a smile, offering her condolences, which I politely accepted. However, there was something unsettling about her cheerful demeanor, especially considering the somber occasion. She then made a comment that caught me off guard. With a casual tone, she said that the house I had inherited from my parents would now belong to her son, my husband, Jack. She seemed completely unfazed by the weight of the moment as she walked through the house, almost as if she were deciding which room she might claim for herself. She even asked out loud, "I wonder if this room would be good for me." The idea of her stepping into my parents' home, this space filled with memories of my family, felt like a violation, a cruel reminder of my loss. I calmly told her that I was the one inheriting the house, but her response was dismissive. "Well, you're married to my son," she said. "Everything you have belongs to him. So in a way, this house really belongs to my son, doesn't it?" Her words struck me deeply, and my frustration began to mount. How could she be so cold, so detached, especially when my grief was still so raw? She went on to suggest that we should start getting along better, as though she was planning on moving in soon. The audacity of her words, her nonchalance, it was all too much. Jack had always been a kind and respectful partner, and I'd been so grateful for his support. We had been married for a few years, and things had always been steady between us. But Ava's behavior at the funeral left me feeling deeply unsettled. This house, my parents' legacy, was not something I was willing to let go of. My mind raced with the need to protect it, to ensure that no one, especially Ava, could claim it as their own. As I tried to process everything, I couldn't help but reflect on my past. I was 44 years old and had almost given up on marriage at 41. Then I met Jack. He was 5 years younger than me, and we hit it off immediately. Our relationship felt natural, effortless. He always respected my opinions, and when we planned our honeymoon, he was more than happy to go with my preference for the Maldives, even though he had originally suggested Europe. It felt like the kind of partnership I had always hoped for. But even with all the joy Jack brought into my life, there was also an undeniable sense of loss. My dad had passed away long before I ever got married, never seeing the day I walked down the aisle, never meeting Jack. I never got the chance to reassure him that I was okay, that I had found a partner I could trust. And now, with my mother gone, I was facing the same grief, compounded by this new layer of tension with my mother-in-law. Despite everything, Jack had been incredibly supportive during my mother's funeral. He was there for me, checking on me, always offering a comforting word. I felt fortunate to have him by my side, especially when things got tense with Ava. At the funeral, I had chosen to hold it at my family home. It felt more personal, more intimate than doing it at a funeral home. Jack respected my choice, even though it wasn't the easiest option. But Ava's behavior at the house was simply beyond comprehension. After the ceremony, she casually commented on how lovely the house was, brushing aside any messes, saying, "Oh, it's no big deal." She wandered around the house, acting as if it were already hers. She even mused aloud, "Maybe I'll take this room." I was taken aback, but her words made it clear that she wasn't just making a passing remark. She was claiming ownership. It felt like an intrusion. It wasn't just my family home. It was my sanctuary in the midst of the grief. I reminded her that the house belonged to me, but she merely smirked and said, "Your parents had no other children, right? And as a wife, everything you have belongs to your husband. So really, this house belongs to my son, doesn't it?" The implications of her words were clear, and the dismissive tone with which she spoke left me seething. I found it hard to understand why she would bring this up now, of all times, especially during such a delicate moment. She then announced her plan to move in. "This beautiful house would be a waste with all these empty rooms," she said, "and I won't have to take care of my husband alone." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. My mind was spinning. How could she be so insensitive, so tone-deaf to the situation? Just then, Jack overheard the conversation and stepped in. "Mom, what are you doing?" "This isn't the time for this," he said, his voice firm. Ava, undeterred, replied, "Why make such a big deal out of it?" Jack, clearly frustrated, told her to leave. "Mom, go," he said. "This isn't the time." He apologized to me afterward, his face filled with regret. "Sorry. My mom can be unreasonable," he said. I appreciated his support in that moment, but my frustration didn't just disappear. I felt conflicted, hurt, and unsettled by how easily Ava seemed to disregard my feelings. In the days that followed, things began to shift in my relationship with Jack. We had been discussing moving out of our cramped apartment, as it was becoming too small. "This place is getting too small," Jack said one day. "Don't you think we should move back to my parents' house? It would give us more space, especially if we're thinking about having kids." I agreed that we needed more space, but I was taken aback by his suggestion. I had never been comfortable with the idea of living with his parents, especially after how Ava had behaved at the funeral. I had hoped that Jack understood my concerns, but as I looked at him, I started to wonder. Was he just going along with what I wanted, or was he letting his mother's demands shape his decisions? His willingness to accommodate Ava's wishes, even after everything that had happened, made me feel like I wasn't being heard anymore. When he suggested that his parents move in with us, I couldn't believe it. I had made it so clear that I didn't want to live with them, but Jack seemed to keep avoiding a firm stance on the matter. Instead of standing by me, he seemed to be trying to stay neutral, thinking it would keep him out of trouble. I confronted him, reminding him of our earlier discussions. "Haven't I told you that we're not living together?" I asked. He sighed and said, "But Mom keeps insisting." His usual response was to avoid conflict by agreeing with both sides, but this wasn't something I could compromise on. I needed Jack to understand that the house wasn't just a physical space, it was a symbol of my family's history, something I wasn't willing to share so easily. One day, after another tense conversation about living arrangements, I walked into our living room to find Jack rearranging the furniture. "What's going on?" I asked, concerned. "Are we packing up for the move?" He looked up from what he was doing and said, "No, I'm just making space for two." It felt like a subtle but powerful shift, a decision to accommodate his mother's wishes, regardless of how I felt. My world felt like it was shifting beneath me, and I realized that the future I had imagined with Jack was now clouded by uncertainty. Would I be able to stand my ground and protect the home that meant so much to me? And could Jack truly support me, or was he becoming more influenced by his mother's wishes than by our shared life together? The mention of two beds sent a chill through my chest. I hesitated before asking, "Are your parents moving in?" Jack's response made my stomach drop. "No, they're moving in today." I was stunned, my mind racing. Despite all my objections, it felt as though Jack and his mother had already made the decision for us, without any consideration for my feelings or input. "Why is this happening?" I asked, frustration building. "Their lease is up, so we decided they'd move in here instead of renewing it. It'll be cramped, but we're moving soon, right? Just bear with it." He seemed so casual, almost as if this was a simple inconvenience we just have to ride out. I could feel my blood boiling. "That's not what I meant," I snapped. "Why is living together even an option?" I had made it clear before that I didn't want to live with someone who had barged into my parents' house during their funeral and suggested taking over one of the rooms as though she had every right to. Jack had promised to talk to his mom, but it was clear they were already set on their decision. "I just don't get it," I said, feeling defeated. "Why do you prioritize everything she says?" Jack sighed, trying to explain. "It's not about prioritizing her. I listened to both of you," he said. But it was obvious he couldn't resist his mother's influence. When it came down to it, I wasn't sure he could even see how much power she had over him, even though I had always seen him as a kind person. Around her, he transformed into someone else. Weak, incapable of standing up to her. My mother-in-law and father-in-law settled into our already cramped apartment. It wasn't long before my mother-in-law started complaining about the lack of space, which only increased my frustrations. I apologized, saying we'd manage until we found a bigger place, but it didn't help. Her dissatisfaction was palpable. My father-in-law Peter was polite at first, but it quickly became apparent that he would follow his wife's lead, unable or unwilling to make decisions on his own. A few days later, my mother-in-law asked me to run an errand for her. She wanted me to buy a medicated patch, a small task, but it was just another thing added to the pile of things I resented. The situation had gone from being uncomfortable to unbearable, and the idea of living together seemed more like a nightmare every day. The more time passed, the more I realized I needed to protect my childhood home. It had always meant so much to me, filled with memories of my parents, and I couldn't stand the thought of them possibly living there. So, after about 12 days of silent tension, I made a drastic decision. I officially renounced my inheritance and sought court approval to give up my rights to the property. When I told my family, I explained calmly, "This house means everything to me. I can't bear the thought of you living there, so I've decided to let it go. I'll keep it in my heart as a beautiful memory." My mother-in-law was furious. "What madness possessed you? You could have sold it for a lot of money. Why just abandon it?" she demanded. I stayed calm. Selling it would only make you rely on that money. I thought it would be clearer if I had nothing to do with it. Her face twisted with rage. "We moved out for this. How are you going to make it up to us?" she shouted. I stood firm. "I've always opposed living together. You forced this situation on us without a proper discussion, so I took a stand." The revelation left my husband and mother-in-law shocked. Their faces went pale, and neither could find the words to respond. My father-in-law Peter just stared, confused by everything happening around him. I turned to Jack, who was visibly shaken by my actions. "I've been thinking about getting a divorce," I said quietly. "What do you think?" Jack stammered, clearly taken aback. "A divorce?" Before he could say more, my mother-in-law shouted, "Jack, you should divorce this ridiculous wife immediately." Her demand was harsh, but it wasn't unexpected. It was a test to see if Jack would make a decision independent of her. Jack hesitated. I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. It was obvious he wasn't prepared for this. I couldn't wait any longer. "Fine," I said, resigned. "If that's what you want, let's go ahead with the divorce." I turned to pack a few things, knowing what I had to do. That night, I stayed in a budget hotel, my mind racing with thoughts of the future. The next day, I took a half-day off from work and went to the courthouse to initiate the divorce. A few days later, my mother-in-law called, her voice shaking with anger. "What's going on? Why is that house becoming yours? What's this sudden change?" I could feel the tension in her words. She had probably learned about my decision to revoke my renunciation through the estate division process. Her frustration only grew as she pressed me further. "The house is supposed to be yours, but you renounced it. Why is it now coming back to you?" I stayed calm. I withdrew the renunciation. It's possible to retract an application before it's processed, and I decided to do that. I let you believe I had relinquished it to gauge reactions and decide what to do next, particularly regarding the divorce. Her face twisted in frustration as she tried to salvage whatever she could. "The property should be split in the divorce, right?" she asked, trying to probe further. I shook my head. "It's an inherited asset, so it's exempt from property division." She continued to press, asking how Jack might benefit from the property division. I responded firmly, "We've only been married a few years. If anything, the division of inherited assets would be minimal." Despite her accusations and attempts to twist the situation, I remained firm. "I'm protecting this house because it holds precious memories of my parents. I don't want people like you living there. If you have further complaints, take them to a lawyer." The divorce proceeded quickly after that. My mother-in-law insisted on speeding up the process, and despite her motivations, the divorce was finalized. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I had successfully safeguarded my father's home from any disruption. Once I moved out, I couldn't help but imagine how my ex-in-laws were coping with the cramped space. My former mother-in-law began searching for a new place to live, but the realities of aging and difficulty with passing rental screenings made it harder for her. Eventually, Jack found a small single-family home for them. It was a downgrade in size, no doubt, but it gave them the privacy they desired. Of course, it came with its own set of challenges. More expensive and likely harder to maintain, but it offered them the space they were looking for. As for me, I found solace in my parents' home, a sanctuary full of memories. It almost felt as though they were still with me in spirit. I had fought for what was mine, and in the process, I had found a fresh start, free from the burdens and tensions that had plagued my life for so long.